It was the year of 1995. The rivalry between Nintendo and Sega was beginning to subside, and a new contender was about to enter the home console scene. Behind the scenes, Sony and Nintendo had a falling out over a console that combined cartridge and compact disc, leading to the console that would push 3D graphics to the forefront and allowing third parties to publish games at a rapid pace. The PlayStation was released by Sony in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, with a release of almost half a year later in North America, Europe, and Australia. During its official lifespan from 1994 to 2006, the console had sold over 102 million units worldwide. While the last game officially sold for the system was Morhun X on July 20, 2005, the homebrew community still creates content for this 24-year-old system. With a 32-bit RISC MIPS R3000A CPU clocked at 33 MHz, 2 MB of system RAM, 1 MB of video RAM, which allowed the console to show up to 4,000 sprites at one time and 180,000 textured polygons, all in 640 by 480 interlaced at 24-bit true color. The PlayStation was a huge leap forward in both performance and graphical capability. I'm Too Late Nate, and you're watching the early history of PlayStation emulation. PSEmu, or later on PSEmu Pro as it was known, was first released in early 1998 and was one of the earliest PS emulators that could run commercial games. It also created the plugin standard that was still used by FPSE today. The first release was on June 4th, 1997 with version 0.01, following suit with many more revisions and updates through 1997 into 1998 before being discontinued in 1999. PSEmu was developed by a number of people including Duddy, the project lead and programmer, Tradix, who programmed much of the dynamic recompiler, Kazuya, the plugin developer and handling the geometry transform engine, and there were a number of others including Rasky and Moonshadow, who shared source code from their Psyke PSX emulator in early to mid 1998. PSEmu Pro developed many different solutions and helped pave the way for open source development projects later on, proving that emulation of the PlayStation was possible on current hardware. In terms of emulation, up to this point, I would say that PSEmu was one of the only, if not the only emulator in the scene that could run some games at fairly reasonable speeds. After it was discontinued, the emulator found new life through updated plugins for a while before finally fading away from the community it seems around 2001-ish. However, it left a very valuable legacy of information and code that helped forge the community for years to come. Now we get to one of my favorite emulators for the PlayStation, Psyke. Psyke was first started on February 1st, 1998 for Windows 95 and 98 utilizing DirectX 5 libraries while being written for Visual C++ 4.0 and NASM 0.97. The group Fab 4, or Rasky and Moonshadow, started this emulation project and it had a working dynamic recompiler in 4 months it seems, which was and still is quite an achievement. It even included a working CD-ROM driver so you could play commercial games straight from the disc. The performance was generally favorable and compatibility, while not at 100%, did play commercial games and demos. As stated before, Rasky and Moonshadow helped the PSEmu team by sharing their R3051 Dynarec code in 1998. I'll go over dynamic recompilers in just a bit, so don't worry. These two were very adamant about emulation remaining free and accessible to all, including the code. In an interview with Rasky, aka Giovanni Bajo, he stated that he had to thank Duddy for the PSEmu Pro emulator because without it, Psyke wouldn't have existed today. The final beta version of Psyke was released on September 16, 1998. It was then discontinued completely and all development immediately halted. I cannot find any chat logs or forum pieces talking about the dead emulator, so if you happen to know about what happened or transpired, be sure to write a comment and let us know so I can update the video accordingly. So you may be going, Nate, what even are dynamic recompilers? Well, in emulation there are two main types of emulation implementation, one being interpreters, the other recompilers. Essentially, interpreters are translating code, line by line, from the system that's being emulated to the target native system or host. This essentially mirrors how a real CPU would work, but comes at the cost of performance. Since an interpreter goes line by line, and more modern and complex CPUs can do more and more instructions per second, you could see how quickly this becomes overwhelming even for today's superpowered chips. The solution to this is a dynamic recompiler, also called a Dynarec or a just-in-time compiler. This type of approach actually translates operational codes from the emulated system to the host system on the fly rather than line by line. It can often do this much faster than interpreters by looking ahead and analyzing code in bulk for decoding, and oftentimes saves results in a kind of data cache. So if it does encounter the same exact code again, the recompiler already knows what to output. The problem with dynamic recompilers is that they are much harder to program and can only be programmed for a specific platform at a time, meaning that an emulator that uses a dynamic recompiler on your phone will not work on your PC because they're two different architectures and would each need a separate dynamic recompiler written for them. I hope this small introductory lesson clears everything up for anyone confused about these two phrases. In mid-1998, SOPE version 0.01 was released for Linux-based systems by SAD, or Sadruddin Rajab. I really hope I pronounced that right. SOPE stood for SAD's OpenGL PlayStation Emulator, which unfortunately was not quite accurate in representation, or at least in the very beginning, because SOPE could only utilize Mesa's specific features instead of using OpenGL at all in the beginning, meaning that the emulator's rendering was quite slow. On top of this, SOPE used an interpreter instead of any kind of recompiler, which means that there was very little chance in the emulator being able to play games at runnable speeds on anything but the most powerful of hardware. This of course wasn't because of lack of programming knowledge or lack of resources, but rather developing for Linux in this point in time was very tough for 3D accelerated applications, because the only way to have 3D acceleration was to use 3dfx on an Intel platform, meaning that if SOPE wanted to be as compatible and portable as possible, it simply couldn't use 3D acceleration without alienating non-3dfx users and Intel users at the same time. However, this changed later on when SAD implemented OpenGL support for SOPE after open-sourced drivers were released for consumer NVIDIA cards, giving massive boosts in rendering speed. A dynamic recompiler was also integrated into the emulator, which massively sped up performance in key areas. A developer called Linus Apps had taken over the project in SAD's stead and updated several features before leaving shortly after a scandal in which Linus Apps was accused of taking CD-ROM code from FPSE, another PlayStation emulation project, and copying it to SOPE. This of course seemed to have been a false accusation and left a sour taste in everyone's mouth. Shortly after this scandal, SOPE seemed to drift into the digital ether of abandonware in 2000. In early 1999, FPSE, or Free or Fake PlayStation Emulator, came to fruition. This project was originally developed by Barrow, but soon attracted the attention of other developers that created the FPSE team. The team consisted of Mr. Fogg, LD Chen, and Barrow. The earliest version I was able to find was version 0.5, which had just barely begun, but by version 0.8, released in mid to late 2000, the project already had a debugger, dynamic recompiler, MDEC media support, and much more. Unfortunately, because of the FPSE team being hosted under EmuSphere at the time, the subdomain seems to have been lost to stretches of time. If anyone has any information on this emulator past 0.8 and the reason for its abandonment, by all means, please post a comment. Of course, we can't talk about early PlayStation emulation without talking about both Bleem and Virtual Game Station. But since I cannot dedicate 20 minutes talking about them, I found that the gaming historian's take on these commercial products is a fantastic resource, and really shows the legal animosity that took place in the late 90s between emulator developers and companies like Sony and Nintendo. I would highly recommend this video if you would like to know more on the actual full story behind these pieces of software. I will put a link down in the description. Bleem was a piece of software developed by the Bleem company and was released in March of 1999. Although the final release was beta version 1.6b in 2001 for Windows 98 compatible machines. There was also Bleemcast, which was the Dreamcast version of Bleem. Bleem was completely coded in assembly and didn't utilize a BIOS for playing games, which meant it ran fast. Originally, the idea was to have 4 Bleem discs, with each one being able to emulate 100 games, which simply wasn't feasible. The team then decided to fork a version on a game-by-game basis to maximize performance and compatibility. The 3 games that were released on Bleemcast were Gran Turismo 2, Tekken 3, and Metal Gear Solid. Each game could be run at 640 by 480 with anti-aliasing and texture filtering, making them look vastly superior to their native counterparts, and even to the emulation of the PlayStation 2 later on. Which brings us to VGS, or Virtual Game Station, also released in 1999, but initially for Macintosh computers, though later VGS would be ported to Windows and could run a majority of games, though without the improved aesthetics that Bleem offered. Later on, there were hacks that allowed the resolutions to be bumped up higher than 640 by 480, and allowed copied games or game backups to be played. The PlayStation is definitely an interesting console for emulation. I find this so because while there was Bleem and VGS, there wasn't really an all-in-one solution that worked across the board, much like Ultra HLE for the Nintendo 64. I also find it very interesting that many of the PlayStation emulators had source code that was readily available, versus projects for the NES and Nintendo 64 in which much of the code was either closed off or the projects never included the source code in the first place, which I think speaks volumes about the differences between these emulation scenes. The PlayStation just seemed to have more information at the ready for development, and one could even buy a Net Yaroze, which was Sony's dev kit, and make it even easier to reverse engineer the hardware. However, it also sadly seems that the PlayStation emulation communities were more thoroughly wiped out during the Great Sweep of '98 than the Nintendo communities, which I find very strange considering how strict Nintendo had always been on emulation attempts. I fully believe that if Ultra HLE had been left alone earlier on and Sony not been emboldened by Nintendo's legal attempts, we would have seen bigger leaps in emulation in the following months. Maybe even something that would have surpassed Bleem in early 2000, but of course, that's all speculation. I would like to sincerely thank all of my dreamers for taking the time to watch this video to the end. After all, it's fantastic people like you that make these videos possible for me to do. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have as much fun. Make sure to support the channel by subscribing and hitting that notification bell for future content. If you do like the content, please hit the like button, it really helps. If you don't like the content, leave me a comment, let me know why, and maybe I can hopefully improve my style so you'll like the next video. I hope you enjoyed our little foray into the PlayStation 1's early emulation history. Have a wonderful night, my fellow dreamers, and as always,